Welcome to everyone who is listening. In this presentation, I would like to tell you something about the scholarly editions of the German Bible Society, about their history and about how their story might continue. My name is Florian Voss, and I am, together with a colleague, head of publishing and foreign rights in the Bible Society. The presentation consists of three parts. First, I will try to explain why just the German Bible Society publishes so many of the scholarly editions, and not, for example, the American Bible Society or the British and Foreign Bible Society. Then I want to give an overview on the most important editions available today. And finally, we will see what is in preparation for the future. One might ask why the German Bible Society publishes so many scholarly editions of the Bible in its original languages. There are probably two reasons for this, a more general one and a rather concrete one. As this is no lecture in history, I might mention the more general reason just in passing. Although Germany was a bit behind regarding the Enlightenment in the 18th century, it does not seem unreasonable to say that German biblical scholarship, alongside with the British, was path-breaking in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Probably it's sufficient to mention names like Julius Wellhausen, Wilhelm Gesenius, or David Friedrich Strauss. If it comes to textual criticism, one might think of Johann Jakob Griesbach, Konstantin von Tischendorf, and Hermann von Soden. It does not come as a surprise, thus, that some of the most influential editions of the Greek New Testament were edited by German scholars in the 19th century. The concrete reason is related to a specific name, Eberhard Nestle, a theologian and Orientalist born in 1851. Late that century, Mr. Nestle knocked at the door of the Bibelanstalt in Stuttgart and suggested a publication. The Bibelanstalt is the legal predecessor of the German Bible Society. Nestle intended to compile a scholarly edition of the New Testament, and in 1898 this edition was published. About the same time, the Old Testament scholar Rudolf Kittel from the German town Leipzig developed a plan for a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. Since its third edition, 1921, this book was also published by the Bibelanstalt. These two editions were then supplemented by an edition of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which came out in 1935. It was edited by Alfred Rahlfs, who was the head of a major research project on the text of the Septuagint, the so-called Göttinger Septuaginta-Unternehmen. Finally, in 1969, the Latin Vulgate, edited by Robert Weber, completed this quartet of scholarly texts: Hebrew Old Testament, Greek Old Testament, Greek New Testament, and Latin Bible. But wait a minute, didn't we forget one important edition? We did. I am thinking of the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament. We will hear more about it soon, but I would like to mention it already here as a symbol of our cooperation with the United Bible Societies. This cooperation is another key to understand today's role of GBS as publisher of scholarly editions. Originally, however, the UBS Greek New Testament had nothing to do with the Bibelanstalt, but goes back to an initiative of the American Bible Society in 1955. Only since 1975, the Greek New Testament is published by the German Bible Society. At that time, we were entrusted by the United Bible Societies with the custodianship for the scholarly editions on behalf of the fellowship, which is the reason why you today find additional editions like Metzger's textual commentary and Newman's Greek-English dictionary or the synopsis in our publishing program. So much for history. Let us now have a look on what GBS provides scholars and translators with today. I will leave out the Vulgate and other editions and focus on the BHS on the one side and the two New Testament sister editions, the Nestle Aland and the UBS edition on the other side, with just a quick sideways glance on the Septuagint. All reliable translations of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible must be based on the ancient manuscripts that have survived to present day. The oldest direct witnesses for the text of the Hebrew Bible are the manuscripts found after World War II in the Judean desert, where they had been hidden in caves near Qumran on the western edge of the Dead Sea. They date back to the period between 150 BC and 70 AD. However, apart from one single transcription of the book of Isaiah preserved in its entirety, the biblical texts from Qumran are fragments. The oldest complete copy of the entire Hebrew Bible is the Codex Leningradensis from the year 1008 AD. Another ancient copy, the Aleppo Codex, dating from almost 100 years earlier, 930, is unfortunately no longer complete. The Codex Leningradensis and the Aleppo Codex are two prime examples of the so-called Masoretic text. What are scholars aiming for when they added the original, initial, whatsoever text of the Hebrew Bible? On the basis of manuscript evidence alone, the best attainable wording of the Hebrew Bible is as it was around 200 BC. Due to the incomplete nature of the text witnesses, however, it would be an almost impossible task to critically reconstruct the text of the Hebrew Bible as it existed at that time. It seems more appropriate to print a copy of the Masoretic text and then list in an apparatus the extant textual variations. The Biblia Hebraica follows this principle. Its first edition, edited by Rudolf Kittel in 1906, was not yet published by the Bibelanstalt, but by a publisher in Leipzig. But in 1921, the Bibelanstalt acquired the publishing rights to the Biblia Hebraica and asked Kittel to revise his edition. As textual basis, Kittel chose the Hebrew so-called Textus Receptus, edited by Jacob ben Chaim. This was a version of the Masoretic text that Daniel Bomberg had published in Venice in 1524-25. Kittel printed this Hebrew text with its vowel and stress marks, but without the surrounding Masoretic commentaries and notes, the Masora Magna and Masora Parva. At the foot of the pages he included a concise critical apparatus with textual variants from other known Masoretic manuscripts and from the ancient translations. The third edition of the Biblia Hebraica, published in 1937 by the Bibelanstalt, was a milestone, in it being based on the Codex Leningradensis that had been discovered meanwhile. From now on, this oldest manuscript of the Masoretic text preserved in its entirety served as the textual basis for the edition. The critical apparatus was divided into two portions, quote, slight variants and less important items of information, and the real textual changes and other more significant matter, unquote. The margins of this third edition included the Masora Parva from the Codex Leningradensis. This publication laid the foundation for the high international esteem enjoyed by Biblia Hebraica. Over the course of time, and as a result of the inevitable wearing of the printing plates, the print quality of the Biblia Hebraica deteriorated, and the need for a complete resetting became evident. A revision also proved necessary for reasons of content, especially in view of the increasing number of text fragments from Qumran that were now coming to light, as they were published by scholars around the world. This task of revising the Biblia Hebraica of Kittel was undertaken by Karl Elliger and Wilhelm Rudolph as responsible editors in cooperation with an international team of Old Testament experts. To distinguish the new edition from their predecessors, its title was given the supplement Stuttgartensia. In the most important aspects, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or BHS, follows its predecessor. For the first time, however, the codex is printed with a complete version of the Masora. The notes of the Masora Parva appear in the outer margin, while the edited lists of the Masora Magna are published in a separate volume. The technical demands of this undertaking presented a major challenge to the Bibelanstalt. For the Hebrew text, a specially modified typesetting unit had to be acquired and adapted, a suitable typeface produced, and typesetters appropriately instructed. The first fascicle of the BHS appeared in 1969 and the work was completed in 1977. To this day, it has remained the only complete scholarly edition of the Codex Leningradensis, with all important text variants and suggested corrections presented as footnotes. This is a good moment for a glance on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which goes back to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Its textual history is complicated. The Septuagint is based on an independent, in part even older Hebrew text than that which later attained canonical validity in Judaism. It then went through an eventful history up to the 4th century AD, when our most ancient complete manuscripts, the major Christian codices, were produced. Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, for example. From the time previous to the 4th century, we only possess fragments, and we have other translations of the Hebrew Bible, such as the ones by the Jewish scholars Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, dating back to the first 2 centuries AD, and the recension of the Septuagint by the Christian church father Origen, which he created for his famous hexapla edition of the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd century. The Septuagint edition, which Alfred Raas edited for the Bibelanstalt, is mainly based upon the 3 Greek codices, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, of the 4th and 5th centuries. Thus, the edition provides a critical text, not being identical with any given manuscript, instead of rendering one specific manuscript diplomatically, as BHS does with the Codex Leningradensis. Variant readings of these 3 codices are fully noted in the apparatus, apart from minor scribal errors, as well as the most important deviations found in the 3 mentioned other early Jewish versions, in the hexapla and also in the Masoretic text. In 2006, we published a revised edition, Editio Altera, of the Septuagint. The revision was carried out by Robert Hanhard, a Swiss theologian and Septuagint expert, who edited many volumes for the Göttinger Septuaginta Unternehmen. Apart from the correction of errors, Hanhard did some changes in the Greek text, but focused mainly on modifications in the text critical apparatus, for example by including some uncials and recensions where Raas had only mentioned the 3 major codices. The textual history of the Greek New Testament in the situation regarding its witnesses differs considerably from the Hebrew Bible. In one regard, of course, the situation is identical. The autographs haven't been preserved. However, the time gap between the creation of the scriptures and the creation of the preserved manuscripts is much smaller, and the number of manuscripts is much higher. Today, some 5,700 of them are extant that contain the text of the New Testament or some part of it. From the earliest times, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, predominantly small fragments are preserved on papyrus, such as Papyrus 52, which contains just a few verses from the Gospel of John and was considered, at least for a long time, to be the oldest preserved New Testament manuscript. These papyri were edited mostly in the 20th century. The important Greek New Testament editions of the 19th century, among them those of Westcott, Tischendorf, and von Soden, mainly made use of the major Greek full Bibles, the already mentioned Greek codices of the 4th and 5th centuries, like the Vaticanus shown on the slide, and of the numerous later manuscripts. Research on the textual history of the New Testament aims to reconstruct the initial text of the scriptures and to understand and trace the later history of the text. The result of this cumbersome scholarship is found in the current editions of the Greek New Testament, of which the German Bible Society publishes 2 particularly influential ones, the Nestle Aland and the UBS New Testament, Greek New Testament. As mentioned previously, the first edition of the Novum Testamentum Graece, edited by Eberhard Nestle, was published in 1898 by the Bibelanstalt. It followed a simple but nevertheless ingenious principle. Nestle compared 3 significant editions of the Greek New Testament from the 19th century, and wherever one of these versions differed from the other 2, he adopted the reading given in the 2 identical versions and supplied a note in the apparatus showing the divergent reading. By this method, he summed up the best findings of New Testament textual research from the 19th century and prevented one-sided views from becoming established. Nestle's edition, due to its wide distribution, ultimately displaced the Textus Receptus, which had been the basis not only of scholarship, but also of virtually all translations since the time of Erasmus, including the King James Bible and the Bible as translated by Martin Luther. The text of the first edition of the Nestle was reprinted several times in subsequent years. Under Erwin Nestle, a son of Eberhard, this edition was further developed with the addition of its own apparatus criticus that cited not only other scholarly editions, but also the most important manuscripts. However, Erwin did not consult the manuscripts directly, but continued to compile his information from other scholarly editions. The patristic scholar Kurt Aland, co-editor since 1952, was the first to verify the information against the originals themselves. Together with his colleagues at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, INTF, which he established in 1959 in Münster, Germany, he also extended the apparatus to include readings from many additional manuscripts. This new approach reached its early culmination in 1963 with the 25th edition, thereafter known as Nestle Aland. Its Greek text, however, was still more or less identical with the one edited by Eberhard Nestle in 1898. But the great manuscript discoveries of the 20th century, especially, as mentioned, of early papyri, necessitated a fundamental reorientation of the text and a rewriting of the apparatus. And these were both introduced in the 26th edition of 1979. The latest edition, the 28th, came out in 2012. It faced two different tasks. On the one hand, the apparatus was subjected to a thorough revision, which should make it easier to use. On the other hand, the text-critical insights and decision resulting from the work on the Editio Critica Major were integrated. The Editio Critica Major, or ECM, is the major critical edition of the Greek New Testament edited at the INTF in Münster, and so far 3 volumes have been published. I will get back to it later. When NA28 came out in 2012, only the Catholic letters, or general epistles, were available in ECM, so that most changes, including alterations to the Greek text, occurred in these 7 writings. You know already that the UBS Greek New Testament traces back to an initiative of the American Bible Society because people thought that the overly complicated Nestle edition did not meet the needs of commentators and translators optimally. In 1954, Eugene Neider, then Executive Secretary for Translations at the American Bible Society, proposed to the United Bible Societies the development of a new Greek New Testament edition. According to his judgment, quote, scholars in the United States were dissatisfied with the present Nestle text, unquote. He got approval from the ABS to, quote, the preparation of an improved edition of the ancient Greek New Testament under the direction of an editorial committee of 5 to 7 scholars, with an advisory committee of additional scholars, unquote. With this approval, the UBS Greek New Testament was born, or rather conceived. Actually, the pregnancy took more than 10 years until 1966, when UBS 1 saw the light of day. Between conception and birth, there was intense communication between the ABS and the publisher of the Nestle, the Bibelanstalt in Stuttgart, resulting in the Bibelanstalt coming on board on the endeavor, alongside with some other Bible societies. The UBS edition offered in its apparatus only variant readings for passages that were particularly uncertain and/or were highly important for the purposes of translation and exegesis. The new edition used the alphabetical letters ABCD in order to grade each variant as to the editor's certainty of its authenticity. In addition to the text-critical apparatus, the editors included a punctuation apparatus that laid out differences in punctuation relevant to the sense of the text in various Greek editions and in significant modern translations. Initially, the Greek text itself included a number of deviations from the text provided in the Nestle Aland up to the 25th edition. This changed with the 3rd edition of the Greek New Testament in 1975. Meanwhile, one and the same committee was responsible for both the Novum Testamentum Graece, Nestle Aland, and the UBS edition, and so it is no surprise that the text of the 26th edition of the Nestle Aland, published in 1979, was identical with the one of UBS 3. The 2 most widely used scholarly editions of the Greek New Testament have thus since shared the same biblical text and differ merely in terms of their apparatuses, introductions, and appendices. Today, the 5th edition is in print. Like NA28, it brought lots of changes, especially in the Catholic letters. Finally, let us have a look into the future, whereby the future of which I speak is already at hand, because two of the editions which I want to present are already published in part, the BHQ and the ECM. Since the BHS was first published, 4 decades have passed, during which much happened in the field of Old Testament textual research. Most important, the fragments of the Qumran manuscripts have now all been published, and research into the Greek Septuagint has made considerable progress. The expectations placed on any edition of the Hebrew Bible have also slightly changed. Of greatest importance, any new edition must provide a clear, reliable representation of all extant textual variants, insofar as they are relevant to biblical translation and exegesis. In this way, the edition will place the readers in a position to make own judgments of any given textual situation. The subjective views of the editor, on the other hand, are to recede into the background and be readily distinguishable from the presentation of actual variants. The apparatus of the new Biblia Hebraica Quinta BHQ follows these principles. The BHQ is prepared by an interdenominational and international team. Head of the committee is the Swiss scholar Adrian Schenker. The BHQ continues in the tradition of Kittel's Biblia Hebraica and is designated by the addendum Quinta, Latin 5th, as its 5th edition. After the first 2 editions of the Biblia Hebraica not yet published by the Bibelanstalt, followed by the 3rd edition based on the Leningradensis, and then, as number 4, by the BHS. As before, the textual basis is the Codex Leningradensis, including the Masora Parva and, for the first time, the Masora Magna. The apparatus, devised according to the principles outlined above, contains much new information. And for the first time, the BHQ includes an accompanying commentary in which the editors elucidate their text-critical judgments, provide a translation of the Masora Magna, and list and discuss the special characteristics of the Masora. The first volume appeared in 2004. Apart from the 5 Megillot writings, including the commentary, it contains a general introduction to the principles of the BHQ. Meanwhile, 8 volumes are available, and the next one, providing Job, is going to be published soon, hopefully. I also would like to mention the major critical edition of the New Testament, the so-called Editio Critica Major, ECM, which is in the process of being published. It is edited by the INTF in Münster, and it documents the history of the text through the first millennium on the basis of Greek manuscripts, ancient translations, and significant citations of New Testament texts in ancient Christian literature. As the initial biblical text is being reconstructed with a newly developed method, it has become evident that the existing text as provided in the Nestle Aland and the UBS edition requires modifications. By now, 3 volumes have been published, providing Mark, Acts, and the Catholic letters. Here you can see the beginning of the Gospel of Mark in ECM, and I can assure you, it looks much more complicated than it actually is. The insights gained in connection with the first volume, Catholic letters, were already implemented in NA28 and UBS 5, as I told you. The insights in connection with the 2 other volumes, published since then, Mark and Acts, will influence NA29 and UBS 6. Nowadays, it is impossible to realize such a project as the work of a single person, or even as the work of a single institution. For this reason, the INTF cooperates with other research teams, among them the team of Hugh Houghton at the ITSE in Birmingham, the Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing, which is responsible for the Gospel of John and the Pauline letters, and the team of Martin Karrer at the University of Wuppertal in Germany, which is preparing Revelation. Although the ECM is the flagship project in the field of the New Testament, the hand editions are definitely also being developed further. In 2012, the United Bible Society appointed a new editorial committee for future editions of the Nestle Aland and the UBS edition. Meanwhile, NA29 and UBS 6 are taking shape. The structure and the main features of the Nestle Aland edition will remain unchanged in the 29th edition. Of course, we will see changes within the Greek text where ECM is available, and the apparatus in particular will be once more thoroughly revised and will be based on a carefully reviewed selection of manuscripts in Mark and Acts. Admittedly, this will be relevant primarily for commentators and expert users and for those who just want to be totally up to date regarding textual criticism. But one change will probably gain the attention of a larger readership. The editorial committee has decided to adapt the sequence of writings to that found in the overwhelming majority of oldest manuscripts. This means that Acts will be followed by the Catholic letters and that the Pauline letters will follow only afterwards. This will also be applied to the UBS Greek New Testament, which will, however, also see other fundamental changes. The trend to aggregate more and more information in the edition will be reversed, because we have to acknowledge that today's students and translators often spend less time with the old languages and with traditional philological exegesis than they used to. The editorial committee thus decided to dispense with information which, according to what we were told by translators and other users of the edition, is used only rarely. This pertains, for example, to the segmentation apparatus. In the textual apparatus, the tendency to increase information in the history of the UBS edition has been especially obvious if you think of the sometimes long lists of versions, church fathers, and lectionaries. UBS 6 will focus on the major versions and the most important church fathers, and will also mention the lectionary evidence only occasionally. The editors also go through all apparatus units in the edition and examine whether they are really relevant for translation and exegesis. Many units will be removed, but of course, some new ones will also be added. In this process, special attention is being paid to the Byzantine tradition because the Textus Receptus, which is closely related to the Byzantine tradition, still plays an important role in the field of translation in many areas of the world. With this outlook, I am coming to the end. Thank you for your attention.